Welcome to AristotleWalks, where ancient philosophy papers are read aloud. The telos of AristotleWalks is to make philosophy accessible for those with vision impairments. Today I will be reading The Origin and Aim of Posterior Analytics II.19 by David Bronstein, published 2012 in volume 57 of Phronesis. The abstract. In Posterior Analytics 2.19, Aristotle raises and answers the question, how do first principles become known? The usual view is that the question asks about the process or method by which we learn principles, and that his answer is induction. I argue that the question asks about the original prior knowledge from which principles become known, and that his answer is perception. Hence, the aim of 2.19 is not to explain how we get all the way to principles, but to defend the claim that our knowledge of them originates in perception. Aristotle explains how we learn principles earlier in Book 2, in his account of definitional inquiry. In 2.19, he explains how we reach by induction the preliminary accounts necessary for such inquiries. Introduction. A science, according to the posterior analytics, is a hierarchically organized series of demonstrations or explanatory syllogisms. The highest demonstrations have as their premises the first principles, archai, of the science. First principles are indemonstrable. Everything else in the science is deduced and explained from them. They are not deduced or explained from anything. Since we cannot acquire knowledge of first principles by demonstration, the question arises, how do we learn them? The final chapter of the Posterior Analytics 2.19 aims to help answer this question. My main claim in this paper is that it aims to provide a much smaller part of the answer than commentators usually think. I begin in sections 1 through 4 with an overview of my interpretation. I then turn in sections 5 through 14 to a close analysis of the text, focusing on the first 3/4 of the chapter, Becker numbers 99b15 to 100b5. Here, Aristotle poses a question about our acquisition of first principles, raises a puzzle that develops the question, and then answers the question and solves the puzzle in 4 difficult, closely packed bits of text. Section 1. Opening moves and overview. In the opening lines of Posterior Analytics 2.19, Aristotle summarizes what he takes himself to have accomplished thus far in the Analytics. Passage A. So it is clear concerning syllogism and demonstration what each is and how each comes about, and so too concerning demonstrative scientific knowledge, epistemes apodeiktikes, for these are the same. Footnote 1. Translations from the Posterior Analytics are my own, although I draw from Barnes, 1993. That passage is from 99b15 to 17. He then announces the 2 questions he intends to address. Passage B. But concerning the principles, peri deton archon, how they become known, pos teginontai gnorimoi, and what is the state that knows them? Tis hegnoritsusa hexis. This will be clear from what follows after we have first set out the problems. Becker 99b 17 to 19. The chapter structure falls easily out of this sentence. Aristotle begins by raising a series of puzzles, Becker 99b 20 to 32. He then tackles the first of his 2 questions, how do the principles become known? 99b 32 to 100b5. And he concludes by answering the second, what is the state, hexes, that we are in when we know them? 100b5 to 17. Despite its structural clarity, the details of II.19 are notoriously difficult to work out, and a variety of interpretations have been defended. In recent decades, however, there has emerged widespread agreement about what Aristotle's account looks like in broad outline. The way principles become known is by epagoge, induction, and the state that knows them is nous, mind or intellect. Footnote 2. See Barnes, 1993, page 268-9, Engberg-Pedersen, 1979, page 317, Kosman, 1973, page 385-6, and Modrak, 1987, page 158 and 172-4. From here, interpretations diverge widely, especially but not only over the question of what role, if any, nous plays in induction. A traditional view is that induction alone is necessary but not sufficient for reaching knowledge of first principles. Induction must be aided in this endeavor by the intuitive activity of nous. Footnote 3. See Bayer, 1997, page 134-7. Irwin, 1988, page 531-2. In particular, by the so-called agent nous of De Anima 3.5. Footnote 4. See Kahn, 1981, page 397-414. An alternative view, defended by Jonathan Barnes, is that induction is sufficient for reaching principles. Nous is the outcome of induction and plays no role in it. Footnote 5. See Barnes, 1993, page 267-70. Lesher, 1973, strikes a middle ground, arguing that induction involves low-level noetic activity, what Aristotle elsewhere in the Posterior Analytics calls noesis, in 131, 88a7, 16. In particular, the recognition of a universal in one or more particular instances. See also Engberg-Pedersen, 1979, page 307-11, and Modrak, 1987, page 160-1. Despite this disagreement between what Barnes calls the easy rationalist and honest empiricist ways of reading the paper, footnote 6, Barnes, 1993, page 259 and 270, at least this much seems clear. Induction, with or without nous, answers Aristotle's first question, nous his second. In this paper, I will argue that, contrary to the prevailing view, induction is not Aristotle's answer to the first question in II.19. My claim is not that the chapter presents a different answer to this question. Rather, my claim is that it presents an answer to a different question from the one usually supposed. Commentators generally believe that when Aristotle asks, how do the principles become known, he is concerned to identify, in Barnes's words, the process or method by which we gain knowledge of first principles. Footnote 7, Barnes, 1993, page 268. Namely, induction. I will argue instead that the question concerns the original prior knowledge from which first principles become known, namely perception. For Aristotle, all learning requires prior knowledge. Footnote 8, Posterior Analytics 1.1, 71a 1-2. And different types of learning require different types of prior knowledge. A natural way for him to answer the question of how first principles become known is for him to identify the prior knowledge from which they first begin to become known, perception. Perception, of course, is not all that is required for getting to know principles, nor is it all Aristotle discusses in II.19. It is, however, his primary focus, the central concept around which the argument of the chapter is organized. My reading departs from the usual view of II.19, according to which Aristotle's main concern in answering the first question is to explain how we reach knowledge of first principles. On this view, Aristotle identifies cognitive states necessary, perhaps even sufficient, for acquiring knowledge of first principles: perception, memory, experience, and so on, and the reasoning by which we acquire it: induction, with or without nous. The view I wish to propose finds in II.19 a more modest project. Aristotle's aim is to explain and defend his radical, anti-Platonist claim that our knowledge of first principles originates in perception. He does so in two ways. One, he identifies the cognitive states that first emerge out of perception, memory, experience, and so on, and that mark the early stages in our intellectual development. And two, he argues that induction, starting from perception, is the means by which we reach one of these early stages, namely, the grasp of a certain kind of universal. Everyone agrees that II.19 explains at least part of our intellectual development. The question is, how much? Section 2. Motivation. One way to motivate my reading is to consider an interpretive problem with II.19, one that arises on the usual way of understanding Aristotle's first question. Commentators often note that when Aristotle addresses the first question, 99b 32 to 100b 5, his account seems to vacillate. Footnote 9, see Barnes 1993, page 259, Modrak 1987, page 161, and Scott 1995, page 110. At the start, 99b 32 to 100a 14, he seems intent on explaining how we acquire knowledge of first principles, in particular definitions, which are the most important type of principle. Footnote 10. Aristotle calls definitions the archai of demonstration, Book 2.3, 90b 24. In Posterior Analytics, Book 1.3, 72b 23-4, he states that the arche of episteme, i.e. nous, is that by which we know the definitions. Definitions are the immediate premises, Book 2.19, 99b 21-22, of the demonstrations that occupy the highest reaches of a science. They are immediate because there is no middle term that explains why the predicate, the definiens, the essence, belongs to the subject, the definiendum. As such, they are indemonstrable. But then in the final part of his account, 100a 14b 5, which contains the chapter's only explicit reference to induction, 100b 4, he seems to revert to explaining something much more basic: how we acquire, by induction, ordinary concepts such as human being and animal. Since definitions are propositions but concepts are not, Aristotle looks confused about a rudimentary philosophical distinction. Footnote 11. See Barnes, 1993, page 271, Kahn, 1981, page 389-90, Ross, 1949, page 675. For further discussion, see N63 and N67 below. But more significantly, since nous is a state that knows first principles, 100b 5-17, and since having noetic knowledge of a scientific definition is much more cognitively demanding than grasping an ordinary concept, he seems confused about fundamental differences in levels of learning, switching problematically from an account of scientific learning to an account of ordinary learning with no apparent notice. To overcome this problem, it is tempting to adopt a deflationary strategy and downgrade the earlier section, 99b 32 to 100a 14, the one apparently concerned with learning definitional principles, to the level of ordinary learning, in line with a passage on induction, 100a 14 to b5. The problem now is that Aristotle seems to fail to answer his first question, which, as it is usually understood, demands an account of high-level scientific learning, not, or at least not only, low-level ordinary learning. However, if, as I wish to argue, the first question does not ask about the process by which we learn principles, but about the origin of our knowledge of them, then Aristotle is not obliged to discuss high-level learning. And if he is not so obliged, then the deflationary strategy can be consistently deployed, or so I hope to show. A second way to motivate my reading is to consider the disagreement I mentioned above between the rationalist and empiricist interpretations of the chapter. Neither option is particularly attractive. Induction, for Aristotle, is the means by which we move from a grasp of several particulars to a universal proposition that identifies something they share in common. Footnote 12. See, for example, topics 112, 105a, 13 to 14. From perceiving that Socrates is two-legged, and Callias and Plato, and so on, I grasp that all humans are two-legged. The rationalist worries that induction so conceived is too weak to get us to knowledge of first principles, and rightly so. To know first principles is to grasp the highest, most explanatory truths in a science and to grasp them as such. Are we really to suppose that we reach this exalted state by a simple process of generalization over particulars? The rationalist solution is to appeal to nous as a faculty of intuitive discovery, which takes us from the results of induction to knowledge of principles, properly speaking. The empiricist, on the other hand, worries that this saddles Aristotle with a mysterious view, one that has little basis in his texts. And rightly so. Aristotle is clear that nous is the state we are in when we know first principles, not the faculty by which we get to know them. Footnote 13. Posterior Analytics Book 1-3, 72b 18 to 25. Book II.19, 100b 5 to 17. For discussion, see Barnes 1993, page 167 to 70, and Kosman 1973. There is truth on both sides. Induction is too weak to get us to first principles, but nous is not part of Aristotle's explanation. The solution I wish to propose is, again, a simple one. We should stop looking to II.19 for Aristotle's account of the process or route by which we reach first principles. The chapter addresses a different and more basic question. Where does the route begin? Section 3. The origin of Posterior Analytics II.19. If II.19 is not the text in which Aristotle explains how we reach first principles, then what is? And if induction is not the method by which we reach them, then what is? There is good reason to think that Aristotle explains how we reach first principles earlier in Book 2, especially in chapters 1 through 10 and 13, in his account of scientific inquiry into essence and definition, what in the metaphysics he calls learning by defining. Becker 992b 29 to 33. Footnote 14. By defining renders the Greek noun in the dative, horismo, Metaphysics 1.9, 992b 32. See also Posterior Analytics 2.7, 93b 38, Topics 8.3, 158b 4. Terms for inquiry, discovery, and knowledge acquisition occur frequently in Posterior Analytics 2.1 through 10 and 13. Footnote 15. See especially Posterior Analytics 2.1 to 2 and 8 for frequent occurrences of zetein, to inquire, to search, heurisko, to discover, and gnonai, to get to know. For similar vocabulary, see also 2.13, 96a 22, 97a 16, and 97b 7. The what it is, or essence, is one of the things we seek in an inquiry, and if our inquiry is successful, it is one of the things of which we have episteme, scientific knowledge. Footnote 16, Posterior Analytics 2.1, 89b 23 to 5. The essence of a thing is what gets expressed in its definition. A definition is a first principle in a science. When we have episteme of a definitional principle as explanatory of some fact, we have demonstrative episteme. When we have episteme of a definition in its own right, we have non-demonstrative episteme, that is, nous. Indeed, having nous of definitional principles in their own right is a requirement for having demonstrative episteme. Since Posterior Analytics 2:1-10 and 13 explain how we seek and acquire knowledge of essence-stating definitions, which are first principles, there is good reason to suppose that these chapters explain how we come to have nous of first principles. As Aristotle says in the Topics, we get to know first principles by means of defining. Footnote 17, Topics 8.3, 158b, 1-4. In Posterior Analytics 2:8, Aristotle says that our search for the essence of a thing is facilitated by our grasp of something of the essence, Becker 93a29, or something of the object itself, for example, thunder, that it is a certain noise in the clouds, and eclipse, that it is a certain loss of light, and human being, that it is a certain kind of animal, and soul, that it moves itself. 93a 22-4. These are examples of what I will call preliminary accounts. A preliminary account identifies a non-accidental property of a kind whose essence we wish to discover. It thereby facilitates our search, which we conduct according to one or other of the two methods Aristotle explains, demonstration 2:8 and division 2:13. Footnote 18. The previous two paragraphs summarize several chapters of a larger work in progress entitled Aristotle on Learning, the Posterior Analytics. I give a brief account of the role of preliminary accounts in scientific inquiry in section 9 below. For further discussion, see Charles, 2000. What I call preliminary accounts, Charles calls stage 1 accounts, and accounts of what terms signify. Aristotle's lengthy discussions of definitional inquiry earlier in Posterior Analytics 2 provide the background against which I propose interpreting II.19. It is a mistake to read the chapter as a quasi-independent treatise on coming to know first principles, cut off, as it were, from the rest of Book 2. Footnote 19. For example, Barnes 1993, page 271, speculates, needlessly in my view, that II.19 began life as an independent essay, ... and was at some later stage tacked on to the discussion of II.1-18. By the time we reach II.19, Aristotle has told us a great deal about how we come to know first principles. What he has not explained is how we acquire the preliminary accounts necessary for definitional inquiry. My suggestion is that it is part of the task of II.19 to do exactly this. Aristotle's claim, I will argue, is that we acquire preliminary accounts by induction, to which he devotes a section of the chapter. Footnote 20. Tuominen, 2010, also argues that II.19 explains how we come to know starting points for inquiry, page 121, and that in this respect the chapter is congruent with what Aristotle says about inquiry elsewhere in Posterior Analytics 2. In my view, however, she spoils her good thought by adopting the more usual line, arguing that II.19 also explains how we reach first principles. There is, however, another question for Aristotle to confront in II.19, another task left over from previous chapters. Imagine a Platonist who believes that the soul possesses latent innate knowledge of first principles. Footnote 21. For an interesting discussion of the Platonic background of II.19, see Adamson, 2010. The problem is that Aristotle's account of inquiry in Posterior Analytics 2:1-10 and 13 does not rule out this view. The Platonist could follow Aristotle every step of the way, agreeing about the methods by which we come to know definitional principles, but all the while believing that the basis of our search is latent innate knowledge of the very principles we seek. The Platonist view is a thesis about origin, not about method. It tells us where our explicit knowledge of principles comes from, not the process by which we acquire it. Aristotle, who rejects innatism, faces a question: what is the origin of our knowledge of first principles? If it is not from latent innate knowledge of the principles themselves, then how do they become known? Pos genontai gnorimoi. His answer to this question, his first in 2.19, is from perception. There is good textual evidence for this interpretation. Near the beginning of the chapter, just after he states his two questions, Aristotle raises a puzzle. We might wonder also whether the states in which we know the first principles, not being present in us, come about in us, or rather are present in us without being noticed. 99b 25-6. The puzzle, which I will examine in more detail below, concerns the first question: how do the principles become known? In fact, it poses a prior question: do they become known? Perhaps they are already known. Perhaps, as the Platonist thinks, latent knowledge of first principles is in us innately. Aristotle thinks principles do become known. He is not an innatist. His question is, how, pos, do they become known? That is, from what origin? Footnote 22. My claim is that the interrogative pos asks after the manner in which the principles become known, and that one way of answering this is by stating the origin from which they become known. This is not the only way of answering the question, but it is the appropriate way given the context in which the question is placed, namely the puzzle about the origin of our knowledge of principles. If the principles become known, they become known from some prior knowledge. But from what original prior knowledge? It will not do for Aristotle to identify some more proximate starting point, since the Platonist can always claim that behind this lurks our latent innate knowledge. To counter the Platonist, Aristotle must go right back to the beginning, back to the original knowledge from which first principles begin to become known. His view, which he actually states twice in the chapter, 99b 32-5 and 100a 10-11, is that, in his second formulation, the states in which we know principles neither inhere in us in a determinate form, nor come about, ginontai, from other states which are more knowing. Footnote 23, I take it that for one state hexis, x, to be more knowing than another, y, is for x to be a dispositional capacity for a higher grade or level of knowledge than the knowledge for which y is a dispositional capacity. Rather, they come about from perception. Apo aestheseos. Becker 100a 10-11. These lines state what I take to be the central claim of the first 3 quarters of 2.19. Knowledge of first principles originates in perception. Aristotle presents the claim as a solution to the puzzle about the origin of first principles. But this puzzle, I have argued, is simply an elaboration of the chapter's first question. So when Aristotle asks, how do the principles become known? He in effect asks, how do they begin to become known? And when he solves the puzzle by adverting to perception, we should hear in this his answer to the first question. In other words, in the context of 2.19, from perception is how the principles become known. The noun aesthesis, perception, and the verb aisthanesthai, to perceive, occur 10 times in the chapter. By contrast, epagoge, induction, occurs just once at the very end of Aristotle's account, 100b 4. Since perception is not a method by which we learn principles, but the knowledge from which they originate, there is yet more reason to believe that the usual way of interpreting the first question is mistaken. Section 4. The aim of posterior analytics 2.19. So far I have argued that Aristotle has 2 tasks in 2.19, both of which grow out of his account of definitional inquiry earlier in Book 2. 1. Identify the original prior knowledge from which principles become known, perception. 2. Identify the means by which we reach the preliminary accounts that form the proximate prior knowledge required for learning principles, properly speaking, induction. These tasks are related. If Aristotle can show that induction, starting from perception, leads us to preliminary accounts, then not only will he have completed his explanation of how we learn principles, he will also have made a strong case for his claim that perception is their origin. Perception is the origin because it gives rise, via induction, to the proximate prior knowledge required for learning principles properly speaking, that is, according to the methods set out in II.1 through 10 and 13. If this is right, then Aristotle is neither a naive inductivist nor a mysterious intuitionist, as the empiricist and rationalist readings of II.19 respectively portray him. Instead, his account of learning first principles appeals to the standard practices of Aristotelian science, explaining and defining. Footnote 24. For a similar claim, see Charles 2000, page 269. While I am indebted to Charles's account, I disagree with his reading of II.19. See below N71. We can divide the whole process by which first principles become known into two main parts. One, the move by induction from perception and memory and experience to the grasp of a preliminary account. Two, the methods of inquiry set out in II.1 through 10 and 13, namely demonstration and division, which begin with a preliminary account and end with noetic knowledge of a first principle. One is a case of learning, namely learning by induction. On its own, however, it does not count as learning a first principle properly speaking. One is a low-level ordinary learning. Two is high-level scientific learning. We may proceed through one without any inkling of the existence of first principles, let alone a desire to learn them. We may reach a preliminary account and go no further. Learning first principles, properly speaking, begins only when we launch a deliberate search. That is, it begins only with two. If this is right, then in II.19, Aristotle does tell us one part of the process by which first principles become known, the first part. He does so partly to complete the account of learning from earlier in Book 2, and partly to support his principal aim in the first 3/4 of II.19, which is to answer the first question by locating the origin of our knowledge of principles in perception. Section 5. Puzzle and Solution. As we saw above, Aristotle begins his approach to the first question by raising a puzzle, the first lines of which I have already quoted. Passage C. We might wonder also whether the states in which we know the first principles, not being present in us, come about in us, or rather are present in us, without being noticed. If we have such states, it's absurd. For then we have pieces of knowledge, gnosis, more exact than demonstration, without its being noticed. But if we acquire them without possessing them earlier, how would we acquire knowledge and learn from no pre-existing knowledge? Ec me pro huparcuses gnoseos. For this is impossible, as I said in connection with demonstration. It is clear then both that we cannot possess these states, and also that they cannot come about in us when we are ignorant and possess no state. Ut agnousi kai medemean ekusin hexin and gignesthai. Becker 99b 26-32. I suggested above that the beginning of this passage gives us reason to doubt the usual way of taking Aristotle's first question. Now consider how he argues in the rest of the text. First, he dismisses the Platonic view that we have knowledge of first principles innately. Then he dismisses the suggestion that we learn them starting from no prior knowledge, that is, from a condition of ignorance. Footnote 25. Aristotle can move from no pre-existing knowledge, me pro huparcuses gnoseos 99b 29, to ignorance, even total ignorance, agnousi kai medemean ekusin hexin and gignesthai 99b 31-2, because he uses the term knowledge, gnosis, to cover a very wide range of cognitive states, from perception of particulars to nous of first principles. Hence, to say in this context that we have no knowledge is to make a very strong claim. It is to deny that we have anything from this broad range of cognitive states. If we have no knowledge, it also seems to follow that we have no opinion, doxa, even though opinion does not seem to be a type of knowledge. For if we have no knowledge, including no perception, then we have nothing on which to base an opinion. I am grateful to Gail Fine for helpful discussion of these points. Innate knowledge and ignorance are not rival methods of acquiring knowledge, but rival and equally problematic candidates for its origin. Hence Aristotle's puzzle: where does our knowledge of first principles come from? Since such knowledge can neither already be in us nor come to be in us, if we do not possess any prior knowledge, one of two things must be the case. 1. Either we cannot know the principles, or 2. We do in fact possess some prior knowledge from which they can originate. Understood in this way, the puzzle brings into relief Aristotle's task in the first 3 quarters of II.19. In order to steer between the twin dangers of Platonic innatism, we already know the first principles, and skepticism, we can never know them, Aristotle must show that first principles can become known, that we can begin acquiring them. And to do this, he needs to identify a type of knowledge, gnosis, that falls between ignorance and knowledge of principles, and is a suitable origin for them. His solution takes exactly this form. I quote starting from the end of passage C. It is clear then both that we cannot possess these states, and also that they cannot come about in us when we are ignorant and possess no state. We must therefore possess some sort of capacity, tina dunamin, but not one that will be more valuable than these states in respect of exactness. And this is clearly true of all animals. They have an innate discriminatory capacity, which is called perception. Dunamin symfuton kritikein, hein kalusin aisthesin. Becker 99b 30-5. Perception meets all the demands for a solution to the puzzle. Aristotle considers it a type of knowledge, gnosis. Footnote 26, see De Memoria 1, 450a 11-12, Metaphysics 1 981b 10, Generation of Animals 123 731a 31-3, Posterior Analytics II.19 99b 38-9. It exceeds total ignorance, but falls short of knowledge of principles, and he is confident that it is a suitable origin from which first principles can begin to become known. One reason for his confidence in perception will become clear below. He believes that although we perceive particulars, not universals, the faculty of perception is receptive of the universals that particulars instantiate, and these universals, once grasped, allow us to seek and learn first principles. Another reason for his confidence is that perception presupposes no other knowledge. He holds that all learning requires prior knowledge, but to avoid regress, he must deny that all knowledge requires prior learning. At some point, we must hit bedrock, and this is perception. Footnote 27. As I suggested above, it is best to think of perception as providing the original prior knowledge from which principles become known, and not the proximate prior knowledge from which we learn them, properly speaking. II.19 also aims to explain how we reach such proximate prior knowledge. It does so with a view to defending the claim about perception. Section 6. Perception and Logos. Let us continue with Aristotle's account. Footnote 28. I divide the remaining parts of the chapter I will examine as follows: passage D, 99b 34 100a 3, passage E, 100a 3-9, passage F, 100a 10-14, and passage G, 100a 14-b5. His puzzle and solution lead directly to a discussion of cognitive development. I quote starting from the second sentence in the previous passage. Passage D. We must therefore possess some sort of capacity, but not one that will be more valuable than these states in respect of exactness. And this is clearly true of all animals. They have an innate discriminatory capacity, which is called perception. Given that the capacity to perceive is present in them, some animals retain what they have perceived, and others do not. Those animals that do not retain it have no knowledge, gnosis, when they are not perceiving, either in general or about the things they do not retain. But those animals that do retain what they have perceived still have it in their soul even after perceiving. When many such things are retained, there is then a further difference. Some animals come to have reason, logos. Footnote 29 in the middle of passage D. Some commentators take logos to mean account, that is, a definition. For example, Barnes, 1993, page 264, Engberg-Pedersen, 1979, page 315-6, Irwin and Find, 1995, page 67, Modrak, 1987, page 162. The problem is that this gives the impression that knowledge of a definition emerges directly from memory, but this is not Aristotle's view, as the next passage makes clear, 100a 3-9, text E below. Instead, logos looks like a placeholder for the longer list of post-memoric states Aristotle goes on to identify in the next passage: experience, the grasp of a certain kind of universal, and nous, the state that knows definitions, principles. If this is right, then the term reason captures well what Aristotle is trying to say. See Aquinas, 2007, page 339, Gregoric and Grigic, I don't know how to pronounce that last name, 2006, page 21-23, Hamlin, 1976, page 176-7, Kahn, 1981, page 403. My objection to translating logos as account or definition also applies to Freda's view, 1996, page 169, that logos stands for nous, given that nous, as 100a 3-9 makes clear, does not come directly from memory. One possible point of confusion is that Freda translates nous as reason, which he identifies as our capacity to grasp principles, whereas I use reason more broadly. Gregoric and Grigic, 2006, page 21-23, helpfully distinguish between basic and noetic rationality, arguing correctly, in my view, that logos in passage D refers to basic rationality. To return to passage D, from the retention of such things and others do not. 99b 32-100a 3. Aristotle begins by identifying perception, an innate capacity common to all animals, as the origin of our knowledge of principles. He then draws a line between those animals that are capable of retaining perceptual knowledge, that is, those capable of memory, and those that are not. He then draws a second line between those animals that are capable of acquiring reason from memory, and those that are not. The second line divides humans from other animals because reason is available to humans alone. Hence, Aristotle lists an ascending sequence of cognitive activities of which a diminishing set of animals are capable: perception, memory, reason. Footnote 30. My interpretation finds support in the parallel account in Metaphysics 1.1. Here, Aristotle says that memory comes to be from perception. 980a 28-9. And he goes on to discuss the different cognitive abilities of animals on either side of this divide, 980b 21-5. He then contrasts those animals that live by perception and memory and who have, he says, a small share of experience, with humans, who are capable of reasoning, logismos, and craft, techne, 980b 25-8. We find then the same sequence of states in the two passages: perception, memory, reason. Aristotle's goal in passage D is to explain the origin of human understanding in the animal world, broadly speaking. He advances the striking claim that our unique cognitive abilities emerge from a capacity common even to the lowliest of animals, perception. He does so with a view to defending his solution to the puzzle we have examined. Since animal knowledge in general emerges from perception, we have some reason to think the same holds true for human knowledge of first principles in particular. Aristotle does not try to explain the process or method by which we come to know first principles. Instead, he provides an argument in support of his claim about where our knowledge originates. Section 7. Perception to nous. The next passage focuses more specifically on the question of our knowledge of first principles. Passage E. And so from perception there arises memory, as we say, and from memory, when it occurs often in connection with the same thing, experience. For many memories form a single experience, and from experience, or rather from the entire universal that has come to rest in the soul, the one apart from the many, whatever is one and the same in all those things, there arises a principle of craft or science, technes arche kai epistemes, of craft if it concerns what comes to be, of science if it concerns what is. Becker 100a 3-9. The interpretation of this passage I defend is as follows. Aristotle identifies 4 stages prior to nous, the state that knows the first principles, which he here calls the arche of techne and episteme. Footnote 31, see Posterior Analytics 133, 88b 39. By nous, I mean the arche of episteme. II.19, 100b 15. Nous is the arche of episteme. See also 1372b 24. Perception, memory, experience, and the grasp of the entire universal. We reach this universal by induction, which he discusses 2 passages below, 100a 14 to b5, text G. Footnote 32. Aristotle says repeatedly that induction is the route from particulars to the universal. For example, Posterior Analytics 1.1, 71a 8-9, and Topics 112, 105a 13-14. However, grasping this universal is not equivalent to reaching a first principle. Aristotle is clear that nous, the state that knows first principles, comes after the universal, for he says that the arche of techne and episteme, that is, nous, arises from the universal, ek to katholu, 100a 6-7. Footnote 33. Contra Lesher, 1973, page 59, who identifies the universal at 100a 6-7 with the arche of episteme and techne. For a convincing criticism of this view, see McCurahan, 1992, page 303, N23, 306, and 95. Tuominen, 2010, page 125, and Salmieri, 2010, page 179-84, make the same mistake as Lesher, conflating what on grammatical grounds alone we must take to be 2 distinct stages, ek ... tu katholu ... technes arche kai epistemes. I discuss Salmieri's view in Bronstein 2010. Nor is it the case that we reach knowledge of first principles directly from the universal. Rather, the universal we reach by induction is a preliminary account required for launching a scientific inquiry. For example, eclipse is a certain loss of light, human being is a certain kind of animal. Posterior Analytics 2.8, 93a 22-4, quoted above. Aristotle omits important stages between the universal and nous, and so there is a gap in his account. However, this gap is not filled by further inductive activity or by the intuitive activity of nous. Rather, it is filled by the methods of inquiry he sets out earlier in Book 2. I now want to defend the interpretation of passage E I have just sketched. First, however, let me state what I take the argument of the passage to be. In passage D, Aristotle says that knowledge of first principles originates in perception. In E, he continues to defend this claim by explaining how it is that perception, our lowliest cognitive ability, can play such a significant role. The explanation is that perception gives rise to memory, which leads to experience, which leads to a universal, from which the search for explanatory principles can properly begin, according to the methods outlined earlier in Book 2. Aristotle does not trot out a series of cognitive states with the hope of convincing us that this is a complete explanation of how we traverse the huge gulf from perception to nous. Rather, he starts to fill the gap between them with a reasonable progression of increasingly sophisticated cognitive states, which mark the early stages, but only the early stages, in our intellectual development. In this way, he once again defends his anti-Platonist answer to the first question and his solution to the puzzle that develops it. Section 8. Experience. Let us look more carefully at passage E, and in particular at the role of experience in our ascent to first principles. My main goal is to explain the contribution induction makes to our learning, but it will take a bit of time to get there. The first two stages in our ascent, perception and memory, are familiar from passage D. Aristotle discusses them in more detail in passage G below. We perceive particulars, for example, particular human beings, Socrates and Callias. Our perceptions leave traces in the form of images in the perceptual part of the soul. Such images, phantasmata, De Anima 3.3, 428a1, serve as the basis for imagination, phantasia, and memory, both of which consist in the cognition of an image representing an object of a past perception. Footnote 34. De Memoria 1, 450a25. In De Memoria, Aristotle distinguishes between imagination and memory. Footnote 35, Becker 450b20 to 451a2. Imagination and memory cognize the same image, but in different ways. In imagination, one cognizes the image of Socrates as an image or picture. In memory, one cognizes it as a copy or representation of Socrates himself. In II.19, he does not. Footnote 36. Unlike Metaphysics 1.1, 980b26. He focuses instead on what memory gives rise to, experience. The role Aristotle attributes to experience in our ascent to nous is not easy to understand. One phrase in particular requires close attention. From experience, or rather from the entire universal that has come to rest in the soul. I have rendered the or as a corrective, footnote 37, see Bayer 1997, page 124 and 38, Charles 2000, page 149 to 51, Irwin and Find 1995, page 67, Lesher 1973, page 59 and 38, and McKirahan 1992, page 243. Indicating that the universal takes the or epexegetically to mean that is. Footnote 38. See Barnes 1993, page 264, Labarge 2006, page 38, Leblond 1996, page 129 and 1, and Ross 1949, page 674. On this view, the phrase, the entire universal, describes what we grasp at the level of experience. It is hard to decide this dispute on the basis of passage E alone. Footnote 39. See Leblond 1996, page 129 and 1 for a survey of views. But a glance at a parallel discussion in Metaphysics 1.1 clearly tips the balance in favor of the corrective reading I have opted for. Aristotle says the following. To have a judgment that when Callias was ill of this disease, this did him good, and similarly in the case of Socrates, and in many particular cases, is a matter of experience. But to judge that it has done good to all persons of a certain constitution marked off in one class when they were ill of this disease, for example, to phlegmatic or bilious people when burning with fever, this is a matter of craft. Footnote 40, translation Ross in Barnes 1971, altered slightly. That was from Becker 981a 7-12. He goes on to say that experience is knowledge, gnosis, of particulars, as opposed to craft, techne, which is of universals, 981a 15-16. And just before our passage, he says that a single universal judgment about similar objects comes to be from experience, 981a 5-7. This provides strong support for the corrective reading, which draws a clear line between experience and the grasp of a universal that emerges from it. In both Posterior Analytics II.19 and Metaphysics I.1, Aristotle says that 1. Many memories of the same thing, II.19, 100a4, 980b 29, give rise to or constitute a single experience, and that 2. Experience gives rise to a grasp of a universal. How are these two moves meant to work? Consider the case of curing fevers. Aristotle's idea seems to be that we have several memories of the same kind of curing process occurring in several different patients. Footnote 41. When Aristotle says that we have many memories of the same thing, I take it he means the same kind of thing. For example, a certain kind of cure for a certain kind of illness, and not the same particular thing. For example, Socrates. We remember that applying leeches to the patient's skin cured Socrates of fever, and Callias, and so on, and together these memories produce one experience. The experience is single, I suggest, because it is of a single phenomenon expressed in a single predicate, cured of fever by applying leeches. At the same time, experience does not consist in a properly universal judgment because the predicate is attached to a plurality of individual subjects, Socrates, Callias, and so on, considered as individuals and not as belonging to a single kind or class. What experience does allow are correct judgments that apply the predicate to other individuals not included in our memories. Because we remember Socrates, Callias, and others being cured of fever by applying leeches, and because these memories form a single experience of fever curing, we can judge correctly that, for example, Coriscus too will be cured in this way. Footnote 42. See Charles 2000, page 151-152. Hence, experience takes us beyond memory and allows for new judgments about and effective interventions in those aspects of the world that fall under our concern. We take the first step beyond experience and toward scientific understanding when we grasp that the individuals familiar from experience form a single kind, which is unified by a common salient feature, being phlegmatic. At this point, we judge that a single predicate belongs universally to a kind. All phlegmatics are cured of fever by applying leeches. In doing so, we grasp the real world, ontological basis of our previous experiential judgments, the feature that was working in the background, so to speak, and guiding our practices all along. Moving beyond experience requires finding the right unifying features, and the right unifying features are those that point the way forward for causal investigation. This account, drawn largely from Aristotle's discussion in Metaphysics 1.1, fits nicely with passage E from Posterior Analytics 2.19. Aristotle identifies two stages, experience, and the grasp of a universal. He characterizes the universal as the one apart from the many, that which is one and the same in all those things. Becker 100a 7-8. The referent of all those things is the many memories that are said at 100a 5-6 to form a single experience. Aristotle's point is that to move from experience to the universal, we must see what is common to all of the memories constituting our experience. We must see, for instance, that it was being phlegmatic that was common to Socrates, Callias, and so on, who, we remember, were cured of their fevers by applying leeches. This interpretation helps make sense of the curious phrase, the entire universal. This is Aristotle's way of signaling that the universal emerges from and comprehends the whole of our previous experience, and in particular all of the memories that help constitute it, a point he emphasizes in the bracketed bit. Section 9. Experience, Induction, and Inquiry. The move from experience to the grasp of a universal, explained and illustrated in Metaphysics 1.1 and summarized in Posterior Analytics 2.19, is an example of induction. Although Aristotle does not use this term, either in passage E or in Metaphysics 1.1, what he describes in the Metaphysics fits the bill exactly. Induction, he says in Posterior Analytics 1.1, is revealing the universal through the particulars being clear. 71a 8-9. In the Topics, he defines it as the advance ephoros from particulars to the universal. 105a 13-14. Footnote 43. See also Posterior Analytics 81b2, 92a 37-b1, Topics 108b11, 156a 4-5, and 156b14, Sophistical Refutations 174a 34. Although he uses the term in other ways, footnote 44, see Ross 1949, page 47-51, and page 481-483, Engberg Pedersen 1979. Induction sometimes consists in seeing a particular in light of a universal. See Posterior Analytics 1.1, 71a 21, and Prior Analytics 2.21, 67a 23. Throughout the Posterior Analytics and the Topics, it usually signifies, as I mentioned above, the means by which we move from a grasp of several particulars to a universal proposition that identifies something they share in common. Footnote 45, see Engberg Pedersen 1979, page 304-5. As we have seen, this is just what occurs in the move from experience to the universal. The universal we grasp by induction, for example, all phlegmatics are cured of fever by applying leeches, is not a definition or first principle of any science or craft. Being cured of fever in a particular way is not what it is to be phlegmatic. It might turn out that the predicate expresses a consequence of what it is to be phlegmatic, a per se accident, but the inquirer who grasps the proposition does not know that at this stage. Instead, the universal is a preliminary account useful for scientific inquiry. The account is useful because it identifies a candidate explanandum whose genuineness the inquirer will seek to confirm. She hypothesizes that there is a non-accidental connection between being phlegmatic and being cured of fever by applying leeches, and she goes out into the world to test her hypothesis against the particular facts of her experience. If her search is successful, she will know that it is not by chance that this cure is effective for phlegmatics. She will know that there is a cause, an explanatory middle term that links subject and predicate in her initial judgment. Footnote 46. See Charles 2000, page 157-70. For a different account, see Gregoric and Grigic, 2006, and Labarge 2006. At this point in her search, she knows the fact that such a connection exists, but she does not yet know the cause, the reason why, though crucially she does know that there is a cause. Footnote 47. This follows the proper order of inquiry according to Posterior Analytics 2.1. First we seek the fact that, then we seek the reason why. According to 2.2, to seek the fact that is to seek whether there is a cause, and to seek the reason why is to seek what the cause is. In my view, we seek whether there is a cause by seeking whether a given phenomenon, for example, phlegmatics being cured of fever by applying leeches, or the full moon losing its light, is a genuine explanandum. This requires that we begin our search with a candidate explanandum, which is identified in what I have been calling a preliminary account. She is, however, in an excellent position to seek the cause because she can return to the particulars she knows through experience and investigate what it is about being phlegmatic that makes members of that kind susceptible to this cure. If her search is again successful, she will eventually arrive at the essence of being phlegmatic, what being phlegmatic is and what explains its other necessary properties. Perhaps it is a certain balance of the four elements. In other words, she will arrive at a definition, a first principle. Section 10. Objection and response. Experience, universals, and first principles. At this point, someone might object that Aristotle's account in Metaphysics 1.1 does not support the interpretation I have defended. I have argued that, when we move, by induction, from experience to a universal judgment, we do not acquire knowledge of a cause, or even a genuine explanandum. We arrive at what I have called a candidate explanandum. However, someone might point out that in the metaphysics passage I quoted above, 981a 7-12, Aristotle says that the universal judgment that emerges from experience is a matter of craft techne, 981a 12. Just before this, he says that craft and science come about through experience when it gives rise to universal judgments of this sort, 981a 5-7. And later in this chapter, he says that the craftsperson, technites, is wiser than the person of experience, because the person of experience knows the fact that, but not the reason why, whereas the craftsperson knows the reason why and the cause. From 981a 25-30. All of this suggests that the move from experience to the universal is the move from the fact to its cause. This means that already at the level of experience we grasp certain phenomena as explananda, and that the first step beyond experience is to grasp causes, the highest of which are first principles. Since induction is our route to the first stage after experience, induction takes us much further than I have allowed. In fact, since it now seems that explanatory first principles emerge directly from experience, induction takes us all the way to first principles after all. Footnote 48, see Freda, 1996, page 161, and page 164-5, and Butler, 2003, page 333. Aristotle's account in Metaphysics 1.1, however, is more nuanced than my objector lets on. Immediately after lining up experience with knowledge of the fact that, and craft with knowledge of the reason why, Aristotle distinguishes between the manual craftsperson, keiroteknes, and the master craftsperson, architecton. 981a 30-31. The master craftsperson is wiser because he knows the causes of the things that are done within the craft, whereas the manual craftsperson acts from habit without such explanatory knowledge. 981b 1-5. It is a mistake, in my view, to assimilate the manual craftsperson to the person of experience. Aristotle distinguishes very clearly between experience and craft, and he is also clear that the manual craftsperson falls within the scope of craft. He is, after all, a manual craftsperson, a hierotechnes. The fact that he acts from habit, de ethos, 981 b5, is telling in this regard. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle indicates that with regard to virtue, we get to know the fact that something is good by habituation, and that such factual knowledge serves as the basis for ethical inquiry into the reason why. Footnote 49, see Nicomachean Ethics 1.4, 1095b2-13, and 1.7, 1098a, 33 to b4, with comments from Berniet, 1980, page 71. We can infer that in Metaphysics 1.1, the manual craftsperson who acts from habit does so with knowledge of the fact that. He differs from the person of experience, I suggest, because his knowledge of the fact is universal, whereas experiential knowledge is particular. When Aristotle says that the universal judgment that comes after experience is a matter of techne, and that techne comes about from experience, he is using techne in the broad sense to cover the knowledge and practice of both the manual and the master craftsperson. Speaking precisely, experience gives rise to knowledge of the universal fact, the knowledge of the manual craftsperson, which then sets the stage for the emergence of knowledge of the reason why, the knowledge of the master craftsperson. Aristotle sets out a more fine-grained sequence than our objector lets on. In this way, my interpretation of Metaphysics 1.1 holds up. Footnote 50. It is true that on my interpretation the sequence is even more fine-grained than the one I have argued we find in Metaphysics 1.1, for I have suggested that there should be a stage between experience and knowledge of the universal fact, namely knowledge of a preliminary account or candidate explanandum, what Posterior Analytics II.19 calls the entire universal, 100a 6-7. Although Aristotle makes no explicit mention of such a stage in Metaphysics 1.1, his account leaves room for it. Section 11. Passage E. Final remarks. To sum up my interpretation of passage E in II.19, from Aristotle's account in Metaphysics 1.1, we learn that experience gives rise via induction to universal judgments, that is, preliminary accounts, useful for scientific inquiry, as described earlier in Posterior Analytics 2. These judgments are useful because they identify candidate explananda from which our causal investigations can depart. Hence, the move from experience to the universal is not, as scholars often suppose, the move from facts to causes. Footnote 51, see McKeer, 1992, page 240 to 243. But the move from particular to universal facts for which we then seek causes by first confirming that they have causes. In this way, and as I suggested above, the sequence Aristotle sets out in passage E, perception, memory, experience, the universal, tells the prehistory of scientific inquiry by identifying the cognitive states that precede the search for causes, definitions, and first principles as discussed earlier in Posterior Analytics 2. Passage E ends with the claim that nous emerges from the grasp of the entire universal. This too is compatible with the account of inquiry earlier in Book 2. If my interpretation is right, then nous emerges only indirectly via the methods set out in 2.1 through 10 and 13. There is, therefore, a significant gap between the universal and nous, just as there is a gap between the first 3 quarters of II.19 and the final section, where Aristotle identifies nous as the state that knows principles. This gap is filled by the 2.1 through 10 and 13 account. But this methodological story is the background to II.19, not its subject matter. The chapter's goal is instead to secure perception as the capacity from which it all begins. Section 12. The route simile. Route as in R-O-U-T. Aristotle's account in II.19 continues. Passage F. Thus, the states in which we know principles neither inhere in us in a determinate form, nor come about from other states that are more knowing. Rather, they come about from perception, as in a battle when a rout has happened. First one soldier makes a stand, then another does, and then another, until a starting point, arcane, is reached. And the soul is the sort of thing that is capable of undergoing this. Becker 100a, 10-14. Aristotle begins by repeating what I have argued is the central claim of the first 3 quarters of the chapter, namely that knowledge of first principles originates in perception. It is striking that 2 of the 3 main passages in II.19, in which Aristotle is commonly taken to be explaining the process by which we reach first principles, passages D and E, are bookended by the central claim. This suggests, as I argued above, that the main purpose of D and E is not to explain how we get all the way from perception to nous, but to argue in support of the central claim. Below, I will argue that the same is true of the main passage in II.19 on induction, passage G. Aristotle's view is that the fact that induction, by which we reach preliminary accounts, begins in perception is evidence that perception is where knowledge of first principles originates. Aristotle illustrates the central claim with an image of an army recovering from a rout. On one commonly accepted view, the image illustrates the manner in which perception of particulars gives rise to knowledge of first principles that are universal in nature. Footnote 52, see Modrak 169-170 and Wheeler 1999, 21-2. Just as the perception of, for example, many individual human beings generates a grasp of the relevant universal principle, so too an army recovers from a rout when many soldiers take a stand together. In support of this view, commentators look to the passage that follows, 100a 14-b5, passage G below, where Aristotle speaks of different universals making a stand in the soul. Since he mentions induction in this context, 100b4, commentators conclude that passage F also describes the inductive process in which the soul moves from particulars to a universal, that is, a first principle. Understood in this way, these lines seem of a piece with Aristotle's alleged attempt to show that we learn first principles by induction. There is, however, another way of understanding the simile, one that has a different set of implications from the view I just described. Footnote 53. For other alternatives, see Lesher 2010b and 2011. It may be that the cognitive analogues of the individual soldiers making a stand are the individual states, hexes, of knowing first principles coming to be in the soul. And it may be that the cognitive analogue of the starting point, arche, the soldier's reach, is the general cognitive condition of knowing first principles, the hexis of nous, which Aristotle calls an arche only 5 lines above. On this interpretation, the route simile represents not the manner in which knowledge of a single universal principle emerges from perception of several sensible particulars, but the way in which nous as a whole emerges from our knowledge of several individual principles. Let me explain. On the reason I am proposing, Aristotle's principal claim in this passage is that the several states, hexes, note the plural, in which the first principles of a science or craft are known, are in a process of developing, ginontai, in the soul, until the point at which the single state responsible for knowing principles, nous, the arche of episteme and techne, comes to be present. The development of such states starts from perception and ends with nous. This much we know from passage E. In this way, passage F summarizes the previous account. But this is not all it does, for it also introduces a new and important idea, one illustrated in the route simile. Each science has several first principles, archai. Each scientist has within her or his soul several items of knowledge, hexes, corresponding to these principles. Aristotle's preferred way of expressing this is to say that the scientist has nous of the first principles of her science, that is, she has the hexes of nous. His point in passage F is that the scientist does not possess nous until she knows a plurality of her science's principles, perhaps all of them. In addition, she lacks full noetic knowledge of any given principle until she acquires nous. Just as the virtues of character must all be present in the agent's soul, together with practical wisdom, Phronesis, in order for them to count as virtues properly speaking, footnote 54, Nicomachean Ethics 6:13, 1144b3 to 1145a6. So too the states in which first principles are known continue to be in a state of development and fail to count as items of noetic knowledge properly speaking until the point at which a sufficient number of them exist together and nous is achieved. To have nous, it is not enough to know one or two principles in isolation. The scientist must have a synoptic understanding of the whole range of principles governing her science. This is what the route simile illustrates. The soldiers taking a stand represent not particulars grasped by perception, but the items of knowledge, the hexes, that develop out of it. Like soldiers taking a stand one by one until they reach a unified starting point from which to make their retreat, the soul acquires knowledge of one principle, and then another, until nous, the acquired dispositional capacity to exercise knowledge of each of the principles of a science, comes to be present. Section 13. Perception and Induction, Preliminaries. We now arrive at our last passage, passage G. 1. Let us say again what we have said just now, but not said clearly. 2. When one of the undifferentiated things, ton adiaphoron henos, makes a stand, there is a first proton universal in the soul, for although one perceives the particular, perception is of the universal. For example, of human being, not of Callias the human being. 3. Again, a stand is made among these things, until things that are partless and universal make a stand. For example, such and such an animal makes a stand until animal does. And with animal, a stand is made in the same way. 4. Thus it is plain that we must get to know ta prota by induction, for in fact perception instills the universal in this way. Becker 100a 14 to b5. This is the passage that would seem to provide the strongest support for the view I have been arguing against, namely, that Aristotle's aim in Posterior Analytics II.19 is to advance the claim that induction is the method by which we acquire knowledge of first principles. He says that we get to know ta prota the first things, by induction. Since he uses proton and principle arche interchangeably throughout the posterior analytics, footnote 55, see Posterior Analytics 1, 2, 71b 21, 72a 6 through 7, 1, 3, 72b 5, 1, 6, 74b 24 to 25, 1, 9, 76a 30. And since nous is the state that knows first principles, it seems to follow straightforwardly that according to passage G, we reach nous of first principles by induction. However, this reading is not a happy one. There are three main worries. The first, which I discussed above, is that induction is too weak to get us to nous. Footnote 56, see Bayer 1997, page 130-2. First principles are the most explanatory entities in a science, and to grasp them by nous, to know first principles as first principles, requires seeing them in their capacity to explain. But induction, while sufficient for yielding knowledge that a certain universal covers a range of particular cases, is incapable of identifying which universals are explanatorily basic, that is, first principles. How then could it get us to nous? The second worry is about definition. If Aristotle is saying that we first learn the definition of human being and then the definition of animal, then he has reversed the proper order of learning, which should go from the genus, animal, to the species, human being. Footnote 57, Topics 6.4, 141b 25-34, see Bolton 1991, page 8. Even if it were possible to learn the definition of human being without complete knowledge of the definition of animal, learning the former would seem to require some grasp of the latter. For how can you get to know what a human being is without some grasp of what an animal is? And yet passage G gives the impression that the universal human being emerges well before the universal animal enters the scene. The third and final worry has to do with perception. It seems to be doing all the work. Aristotle says that it instills the universal, 100b5, and that it is of the universal, 100a17. If these universals are principles known by nous, he seems to be saying that we move in one leap from perception to nous, but we know this is not the case. The interpretation of II.19 I have defended points toward a different and I believe more satisfying reading of the passage. It is uncontroversial to say that the passage describes how we acquire a grasp of certain universals. I suggest that these are the same universals Aristotle discusses in passage E, the entire universal, 100a 5-6. The preliminary accounts that emerge from perception, memory, and experience. But what then are we to make of the claim in G4 that we get to know ta prota by induction? In G2, Aristotle speaks of our acquisition of a proton first universal. I suggest that prota in G4 picks up on proton in G2. Aristotle's claim is that we get to know the first universals by induction. First is a fitting term given that these are, as I argued above, preliminary accounts used as starting points in scientific inquiry. On this reading, ta prota are first in the order of learning, not in the order of knowing. Passage E identifies the states from which we acquire these first universals: perception, memory, and experience. G supplements this account by identifying the means by which we acquire them: induction. In this way, G contributes to the main argument of the first 3 quarters of II.19. Since induction starting from perception gets us to first universals, And since these universals are necessary for scientific inquiry, and since successful inquiry ends with noetic knowledge of a first principle, Aristotle is justified in claiming that our knowledge of first principles originates in perception. This interpretation makes good sense of the last part of G4, where Aristotle explains, Gar, his remark about induction. For in fact, perception instills the universal in this way. The universal perception instills is a first universal, a preliminary account closely tied to our perceptual experience, and the way perception instills it is by induction. If this interpretation of ta prota in G4 is right, then passage G does not claim that induction is the way we acquire knowledge of first principles. Instead, it claims that induction is the way we get to know the universals that facilitate the search for definitions, which is where the real work of learning first principles takes place. Footnote 58. Kahn, 1981, page 396-7, gestures at an account similar to my own. As described in II.19, induction seems to account only for a nominal definition, what Bronstein calls a preliminary account, of eclipse as darkening of the moon. The gap between this and the scientific account given by Anaxagoras would have to be filled by a much more complex theory of induction and scientific method, which Aristotle scarcely attempts." End quote. Page 396. In my view, Bronstein's view, 2:1 through 10 and 13 present the method Kahn finds missing. As such, induction is necessary for coming to know first principles, but not sufficient. Footnote 59. My interpretation is consistent with Aristotle's three main discussions of induction and first principles outside of Posterior Analytics 2.19. Posterior Analytics 1.18, Nicomachean Ethics 1.7, 1098b 3-4, and Nicomachean Ethics 6.3, 1139b 28-31. Each of these passages implies the weak claim that induction is necessary for learning principles, not the strong claim that it is sufficient. Section 14. Perception and Induction. Details. Let us look more closely at passage G, a challenging text on anybody's reading. G2. When one of the undifferentiated things makes a stand, there is a first proton universal in the soul. For although one perceives the particular, perception is of the universal, for example, of human being, not of Callias, the human being. Aristotle begins to clarify our acquisition of universals by assigning an important role to perception. Most scholars take one of the undifferentiated things to be one of the infimi species. Footnote 60. See Barnes 1993, page 266, McCurahan 1992, page 245, Ross 1949, page 677. For example, human being, which is undifferentiated because it cannot be subdivided into further species. The problem with this reading, as Barnes points out, is that the burden of the passage is to explain how we acquire a grasp of such universal species. Footnote 61, see Barnes 1993, page 266. See also Tredenik's Loeb translation and Bayer 1997, page 126. Far from explaining their acquisition, Aristotle begins the passage by assuming we already have them. A better reading assigns a different meaning to undifferentiated. Aristotle often uses it to refer to particulars, Callias, Socrates, and so on, which are undifferentiated, that is, the same, not different in species. Footnote 62. Adiaphora katato e dos, Topics 103a 10-11, Parts of Animals 644a 24, Decailo 277a 2. This is exactly how Aristotle uses undifferentiated in Posterior Analytics 2.13, 97b7 through 8. He recommends that we examine things that are undifferentiated in species, that is, particulars, as the example he goes on to give makes clear, 97b17. It is also how he defines one of the three types of sameness in topics 1.7, 103a10 through 11. There is sameness in species when there are several things undifferentiated in species. For example, one human and another human, one horse and another horse. Loeb translation a little modified. For a similar interpretation of undifferentiated in G2, see Salmieri, 2010, page 165-6. For a much different interpretation, see Bolton, 1991, page 6 through 9, who takes each of them to be a unity composed of as yet undifferentiated things, page 6, and identifies them with the confused universals discussed in Physics 1.1. Attractive as this reading is, I have found no other passage in Aristotle where undifferentiated has this meaning, and Bolton cites none, which gives us some reason for doubt. Aristotle's point is that when a particular human being, for example Callias, makes a stand in the soul, we acquire a first universal. Callias makes a stand in the soul when, as a result of perceiving him, we retain a perceptual image that represents him, that is, a memory. The next step is to understand how it is that when we retain a perceptual image of a particular, we possess a first universal. Suppose I have perceived one human being, Callias, and possess as a result one retained perceptual image of a human being, an image of Callias. I have not thereby reached the universal proposition all human beings are two-legged animals, that is, a preliminary account of a human being. However, Callias instantiates a number of universal properties, such as being a human being an animal, being two-legged, and so on. In virtue of receiving and retaining a perceptual image of Callias, I receive and retain, although I do not yet grasp, the universals encoded in the image. So when Aristotle says that when I retain an image of Callias there is a first universal in my soul, he means that there is a first universal in my soul potentially. To decode the relevant universals and reach a preliminary account, I need to acquire a number of other images of particular human beings and then move inductively to a universal proposition that identifies something they all share in common. For example, all human beings are two-legged animals. Footnote 63. It is reasonable to think that in cases of low-level learning such as I discuss here, our inductive advance is more or less unconscious and not the outcome of a deliberate inference or search. What Aristotle describes in passage G seems to be a process of basic concept acquisition, although I have characterized it as the acquisition of certain propositions. The line between concept and proposition is difficult to draw in this context. See N67 below. However, in scientific inquiry, we can use our inductively acquired concepts as the basis for our preliminary accounts. In other cases, our inductive advance may involve a deliberate inference and search. For example, the case I discussed above, in which we grasp that all phlegmatics are cured of fever by applying leeches. If this interpretation is right, then we can make good sense of Aristotle's otherwise mysterious statement in the second part of G2, that although one perceives the particular, perception is of the universal, for example of human being, not of Callias the human being. When we perceive a particular, for example Callias, we retain a perceptual image that represents it. The content encoded in this image outstrips what the faculty of perception alone can grasp, since the content includes universals, for example, human being, two-footed, that the perceived particular instantiates. So the faculty of perception is receptive of universals, even though it cannot apprehend them as such. This is along the lines of Aristotle's claim in Metaphysics 7:11 that animal, the universal, is perceivable. Becker 1036b 28-9. He does not mean that the universal kind as such is perceivable. Rather, he means that animal is a kind whose particular members, this man, that horse, are perceivable. Similarly, perception is of the universal, not because the universal is perceivable, but because the universal is instantiated in particulars, each of which is perceivable. And in virtue of this fact, the universal is encoded in the images we receive when we perceive particulars. Footnote 64. Compare Aristotle's claim in Posterior Analytics 131 that perception aesthesis is of what is such and such to toiude, i.e. universal, 87b 28-9. Here too he insists that we perceive aesthenisthai particulars and that it is impossible to perceive universals, 87b 29-31. He clarifies the connection between perception and the universal at the end of the chapter when he says that it is from and not by seeing that we grasp universals, 88a 12-14. He means, I take it, that on the basis of perceiving particulars we grasp via induction the universal. This is the same claim he makes in passage G. Perceiving particulars is necessary but not sufficient for reaching universals. We need the perceptual faculty as a whole, including imagination and memory and experience, which provide the basis for our advance. In G4, Aristotle calls the advance to the universal induction. For example, from our grasp, acquiring via perception, memory, and experience that several particular human beings, Callias, Socrates, and so on, are two-footed animals, we grasp that all human beings are two-footed animals. Passage G gives a sketch, but only a sketch, of how this takes place. As a result of perceiving Callias, Socrates, and so on, we retain perceptual images, crudely put mental pictures, footnote 65, De Memoria 1, 450a, 29-30, b 16 and 20. Representing each of them, when one of the undifferentiated things makes a stand. These images resemble each other in some respects and differ in others. We have what Aristotle in passage E calls experience when we take one of these common features, for example, being a two-footed animal, and predicate it individually of each of the particulars represented in our images. So we perceive that Callias is a two-footed animal and Socrates and so on, and we apply the same predicate to new particulars we encounter. Induction takes place when we grasp that this common feature holds true of all members of a kind designated by a single term, for example, all human beings. Footnote 66. Posterior Analytics 131, 88a 16 gives us some reason to think that Aristotle's term for our grasp of the universals obtained via induction is noesis. However, contra Lesher 1973, it does not follow that nous is what grasps such universals, nor does it follow that there is no difference between noesis of such universals and nous of first principles. In the Posterior Analytics, noesis is used for our grasp of any universal connection. Nous is reserved for our knowledge of first principles. Elsewhere in the corpus, there is a tighter connection between the two. Noesis is the activity of nous. See Metaphysics 12.9, 1074b 15-35. See McKirahan, 1992, page 257-259, whose objections to Lesher's account I take to be decisive. The perceptual faculty makes an essential contribution to this, for induction must proceed from particulars, our only access to which is through perception. Posterior Analytics 11881b 5-9. Hence, Aristotle can claim in the final cause of G4 that perception instills the universal in this way, namely by induction. For however brief and sketchy his account may be, G2-3 does make it clear that the faculty of perception provides the resources for our inductive advance. The universals we acquire by induction are, as I suggested above, the preliminary prota accounts we use to launch our scientific inquiries, the same ones Aristotle has in mind in his discussion of the entire universal in passage E. For example, all human beings are two-footed animals. In Posterior Analytics 2.8, in the list of preliminary accounts we use to begin inquiring, we find human being is a certain kind of animal, 93a 23-4. The phrase a certain kind is a placeholder for a quality all human beings share, a quality that, according to passage G, we should be able to access through perception, hence two-footed is a good candidate. This preliminary account serves as the basis for our search for the complete definition, which expresses the complete essence of human being, for example, two-footed terrestrial animal or rational animal. Footnote 67. My interpretation is similar to a version of what we might call the concept view of passage G. According to this view, Aristotle draws no strict distinction between concepts and propositions because he assumes that grasping concepts involves or can be cashed out in terms of grasping propositions, and passage G describes our acquisition of such concepts or propositions. See Barnes, 1993, page 271, Bayer, 1997, page 119 and 22, Charles, 2000, page 264 and 37, Hamlin, 1976, page 178, Kahn, 1981, page 393-5, McGirahan, 1992, page 246-7, Modrak, 1987, page 162 and 164. For example, grasping the concept human being involves grasping a proposition such as human beings are two-footed animals. The main reason I avoid using concept, preferring instead preliminary account, is that concept risks obscuring what I take to be the central question about passage G. Does it describe our acquisition of full-fledged scientific definitions? I say no, but not all defenders of the concept view agree, for some think that grasping a concept involves or can be cashed out in terms of grasping a complete definition. See Charles, 2000, page 264 and 37, Modrak, 1987, page 164. G3. Again, a stand is made among these things until things that are partless and universal make a stand. For example, such and such an animal makes a stand until animal does, and with animal a stand is made in the same way. In G3, Aristotle indicates that the inductive process by which we get to low-level universals, such as human being, repeats itself at higher levels of generality. By these things, Aristotle means a plurality of less general universals, for example, human being, horse, and by making a stand, he means grasping a feature they share in common. In this way, G2 and G3 describe different types of inductive advance. In G2, we move from memories of several particulars to the grasp of a universal that covers them. In G3, we move from the grasp of several universals to the grasp of a more general universal that covers them. Since Aristotle defines induction as the advance from particulars to a universal, the idea in G3 seems to be that first-level universals are treated as if they were particulars, and we move from them to the next level of universality. The process is then repeated, the second-level universals are treated as particulars, and so on. For example, from our grasp that all humans are two-footed animals and all horses are four-footed animals, and so on, we grasp that all footed animals, animal of such and such a kind, are of a certain sort, for example, land-dwelling. We are then led to grasp something about all animals, for example, that they are living beings of a certain sort. From living being, we eventually grasp something about all substances, one of the partless universals. Footnote 68, I follow Ross, 1949, page 678, in taking the partless things to refer to the categories of being, substance, quality, quantity, etc. At which point our ascent comes to a stop. Footnote 69, Compare the similar sequence in Posterior Analytics 122, 83b 3-4. Human being is two-footed. This, i.e. two-footed, is animal. This, i.e. animal, is another thing. The result of each inductive step is a preliminary account, which can then serve as the basis for an inquiry into the relevant item's essence. Conclusion. Induction on the reading of II.19 I have defended does not have definitional force. Its direct outcome is not knowledge of a first principle. The preliminary accounts we acquire by induction do not state the basic essences of the relevant kinds, and so they are not full-fledged scientific definitions. Footnote 70. In Posterior Analytics 2.7, 92a37-b1, Aristotle remarks that induction does not prove what a thing is, but that it is or is not something. Rather, they identify features of those kinds that allow us to seek the essences. Footnote 71. Charles, 2000, page 266-9, objects to deflationary interpretations of the general sort I defend, on the ground that they are not sufficient to rule out a Platonist reading of Posterior Analytics 2.19, according to which we come to grasp principles by nous, conceived of as a faculty of intuition. This is what I called the rationalist and intuitionist view above. I have tried to block this objection by arguing that while there is a gap between the knowledge we gain by induction, as described in II.19, and noetic knowledge of principles as principles, this gap is not filled by the intuitive activity of nous, as Charles worries it will be, but by the account of inquiry earlier in Book 2, where definition and explanation, not intuition, play central roles. Aristotle does not need induction to contribute anything more to our acquisition of first principles in order for him to answer the first question he raises at the start of II.19. How do the principles become known? For as I have argued, the question concerns the original prior knowledge from which first principles begin to become known, not the whole route we traverse to them. Footnote 72. Earlier drafts of this paper were presented at Cornell, University of Massachusetts Amherst, Oxford, and Princeton. I am grateful to the audience members for their comments and questions on these occasions. I also thank James Allen, David Charles, Gail Fine, Terence Irwin, James Lesher, Nate Mavis, Ben Morrison, David Rochnick, Christopher Shields, Ian Wells, and an anonymous referee for this journal. References: Peter Adamson's 2010, Posterior Analytics 2.19, A Dialogue with Plato. Aquinas' Commentary on Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, the 2007 version. Jonathan Barnes, 1971, The Complete Works of Aristotle, both volumes. Jonathan Barnes, again, 1993, Aristotle Posterior Analytics. It's a book. Greg Bayer, 1997, Coming to Know Principles in Posterior Analytics 2.19. Robert Bolton, 1991, Aristotle's Method in Natural Science, Physics 1, in Aristotle's Physics, a collection of essays. David Bronstein's own paper in 2010 comments on Gregory Salmieri, Eistasis Empiria, and the Advent of Universals in Posterior Analytics 2.19. Miles Burnyeat's 1980, Aristotle on Learning to Be Good, in Essays on Aristotle's Ethics. Travis Butler's 2003 paper, Empiria in Aristotle. David Charles's 2000 paper, Aristotle on Meaning and Essence. Engberg Pedersen's 1979 paper, More on Aristotelian Epagoge. Freda's 1996, Aristotle's Rationalism in Rationality in Greek Thought. Gregoric and Grigic, 2006 paper, Aristotle's Notion of Experience. D.W. Hamlin's 1976 paper, Aristotelian Epagoge. Terence Irwin's 1988 book, Aristotle's First Principles. Terence Irwin and Gail Fine's joint book in 1995, Aristotle Selections. Charles Kahn's 1981 paper, The Role of Nous in the Cognition of First Principles in Posterior Analytics 2.19. L.A. Kosman's 1973 paper, Understanding, Explanation, and Insight in Aristotle's Posterior Analytics. Scott Labarge's 2006 paper, Aristotle on Empiria. J.M. Leblan's 1996 Logic and Method in Aristotle, but that's in French. I can't pronounce French. J.H. Lesher's 1973 paper, The Meaning of Nous in the Posterior Analytics. More of Lesher, 2010, From Inquiry to Demonstrative Knowledge, New Essays on Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, a book. Another paper from Lesher, 2010b, Just as in Battle, the Simile of the Route in Posterior Analytics, II.19. Another paper by Lesher, 2011, A Note on the Simile of the Route in the Posterior Analytics, II.19. Richard McKirahan's 1992 book, Principles and Proofs, Aristotle's Theory of Demonstrative Science. Deborah Modrak's 1987, Aristotle, the Power of Perception, a book. Ross's 1949 book, Aristotle's Prior and Posterior Analytics, a revised text with introduction and commentary. Gregory Salmieri's 2010 paper, Aesthesis Empiria and the Advent of Universals in Posterior Analytics, 219. Dominic Scott's 1995 book, Recollection and Experience. Mira Tuominen's 2010 paper, Back to Posterior Analytics 219, Aristotle on the Knowledge of Principles. Mark Wheeler's 1999 paper, Concept Acquisition in Posterior Analytics 219. And I am so sorry if I messed up anyone's names. There is a famous Soviet chess player by the name of David Bronstein, but the David Bronstein of our paper today is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. He completed his PhD at the University of Toronto, and before coming to teach at Georgetown, he taught at both Oxford and Boston University. He's also currently a lecturer at the University of New South Wales. His areas of specialty are in ancient epistemology, ethics, metaphysics, and philosophy of science, and he has a great book called Aristotle on Knowledge and Learning, the Posterior Analytics, printed by Oxford University Press in 2016. In the paper, in one of the footnotes, he actually alluded to this book. I've actually met him in a course on Aristotle and geometry taught by Professor Benjamin Morrison at Princeton, and he was very nice. If you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. I hope that this recording has been and will be helpful to you. The goal, the end, the telos of AristotleWalks is to make philosophy, in particular ancient but also contemporary, more accessible. For the ancient philosophy portion of this channel, I am thinking primarily about students and scholars who have vision impairments. For those who merely prefer to learn by ear, I hope this channel may benefit you too. The YouTube channel AristotleWalks is a counterpart and antistrophos to my original Instagram account AristotleWalks, where I post excerpts of Aristotle's works almost every day. I would appreciate it if you followed it and or subscribed to this channel. Thank you, and I hope you have a lovely day.